I want to make clear something, unfortunately, in the current context, I must tell you that many of you who came here to hear a course on philosophy and human values probably expected more philosophy and less on the human values side. Well, I hope some of you were here yesterday when I ran through a series of ethical theories, and I think I gave some arguments. That was my professionalizing work. In other words, that was the display of my rough credentials to do this. Now I'm on to a topic of which I consider, and so far, in a way, it's just groundwork for the other stuff, because all of the great ethical theories of the past, in a way, do contain utopian moments. In a way, being a Stoic, an Epicurean, being someone who pursues excellence, are all interesting and historically recoverable, in a certain sense, projects. What I pointed out today is that the situation in which we find ourselves in modern life, in the present, means that there are other conditions that must be met to even pursue those projects. So I don't see the two sets of remarks as different as you might think. It's not as I did philosophy one day and politics the next, because such watertight distinctions are not viable between philosophy and politics. And again, before I return to Marx, let me try to indicate that the priority of politics is marked even in the Greeks, where the last thing that Aristotle wrote was a constitution for Athens. He wrote that, last, after he had written the metaphysics, the physics, the logic, and all this. I have a feeling that he thought that constitution as important as anything he wrote. We certainly know about Plato writing the Republic, that remark about the best kind of state, and that debate in Plato is certainly as important as anything he wrote. So, in a way, even the classic philosophers, the ones that the people from the National Association of Scholars love, understand that politics, as it were, sets those boundary conditions and those necessary conditions within which human beings can pursue things like a good life for themselves. And so those are the conditions that I was discussing last time, and trying to discuss them in the context of the present. And for that I found Marx helpful in one respect. I want to point out something about that, though. There is a severe problem with the writings and the work of Marx that's all too obvious to us today, and that's that the assumption that workers shaping and forming their own modes of work wouldn't fall victim to the power of the state, which would now step in place of a capitalist class, exploit their labor in the same way, not exactly in the same way, they'd use different words and all that. As I said, pretty much from the bottom, it's hard to tell the difference. But, they'd use a different ideology. But his expectation that the state would do more than administer and would actually control the life of people was an absolute blind spot in his work. But then look at our liberal theorists. For them, an equal blind spot is that while they pay lip service to wanting to constrain the state, and let free enterprise flourish, that led, when it was tried, and it hasn't been tried in a long time, when it was tried, it led to a great, deep, worldwide depression that scared the capitalist class so much that no one's ever tried it again since. And no one plans to. President Reagan came into office promising to shrink the size of the state. As you may know, as a matter of fact, it's larger than ever. So that the process of a world becoming bureaucratically more complex and intrusive at the level of the state is a world phenomenon. It's not localizable. The process of an economy becoming ever more diverse, commodifying ever more sections of our lives, until we replace the Sunday stroll, to use another example. I mean, I'm old enough to remember that. When I'd go with my granddad, we'd go for a stroll on Sunday. Well, that can't be done now without a relation to the commodity. Well, it could be, but rarely is. We're socialized to go for a stroll someplace else on Sunday now. The mall is open in the afternoon, and even in North Carolina after church, they open it up after church. stroll through the mall, so that you can both stroll and shop. Sort of the strolling aspect is still important. I mean, I'm not saying that it's not kind of kinky to walk around and watch people buy things. It's amusing. So I don't want you to think that Marx has a critique of capitalism only, and that's all I'm interested in. The critique of the state and the state bureaucracy is also important. And I've mentioned the name of Max Weber, but I didn't bring in any of his books. They're real thick, real boring, and I've suggested that a sense for what a modern bureaucracy is like can be evoked from reading the novels of Franz Kafka. Things like Before the Law and The Trial give you more of a sense of being caught in a modern bureaucracy. And all of you have that sense anyway. If you've moved to a new city and tried to hook up a telephone and they say, go to room 238. You go to room 238 and they say, where'd you come from? Who'd you talk to? You go, I forgot. They go, oh no, you'll have to go back to room 104. You go to 104. 104 says, you've been to 232. Well, you can't come to room 104. Yeah, we all know this. And so for that, that's what modern bureaucracies look and feel like, So for that, go to Kafka. So what I was trying to develop last time was a criticism of the state and the economy, of a new arising global order that now, I guess, has become popular enough to deserve the moniker New Order. A new order. I'm always suspicious of new orders. So now I'm going to drop back a level and look at some of the other factors that go into it, into the formation of human values, other than, although I still think these are crucially important, other than the economic ones. And for that purpose, I just can't restrain myself from looking at a couple more of the critics of modernity, you might call critics of modern life, of the modern state, the modern economy, and of the conditions in which our modern culture is formed. And one of those critics that I think's come under fire in Time magazine and elsewhere is Nietzsche. You may have heard of him, Nietzsche. It's very popular now to see Nietzsche as sort of the new threat. In the 60s, the right wing was worried that too many college professors read Marx. They don't worry about that anymore. People like Jan Ilster run huge institutes. They're analytic Marxists. That's respectable. Now you're looked at sort of, it's a little funny, if your interest is in Nietzsche. And I'll try to explain first what's supposed to be so scandalous about Nietzsche. Nietzsche is supposed to hold the scandalous view that knowledge is a form of power. Now that's scandalous because knowledge is knowledge. It's objective, like journalism. And it would be scandalous to show that wherever we find knowledge, we will find it structured and constructed around a system or systems of power. Won't find one without the other. Now, one can think of this along the simplest pedagogical models. By that I mean the classroom models. I ought to know this from teaching the university. I know how to pass along knowledge. To get someone to believe me in the last analysis, I give them an A, which I could replace with a happy face. They're used to that. That's from kindergarten. They're both just symbols, right, of achievement. They're not getting paid for this stuff, right? You just give them a little A, they smile. That same system starts in kindergarten, happy face, A, runs through there. F, no face, blank. Same thing would work in kindergarten. That form I use looks fair. I'm grading objectively, but the point is deeper, that what the knowledge is based on is my spot of power as the teacher. That's what it's based on. Now, you would go, oh no, it's based on what's really true. Yeah, but how does that get meted out and parsed out? Who decides that? Well, the blunt and ugly answer is we do. The teachers do. We decide. Now, there are clear counterexamples to Nietzsche's argument. In mathematics, at its simplest levels, I will grant you that if we're doing a mathematics course, I can grade objectively. But I will also grant you that nothing of great importance to human values hangs on truths that everyone can accept. That 2 + 2 is 4, that A is A, are all acceptable, and they're acceptable precisely because nothing of very great human importance hangs on them. The moment you go a little beyond that in any direction, even in math class, when you discuss, for example, the philosophy of mathematics, then the disputes start, and then power at some point has to insert itself and decide. So an important part of Nietzsche's investigation is in the interconnection between forms of knowledge and power. Forms of, for purposes of our course, forms of ethical behavior and power are the subject of his most important book. Well, maybe not his most important, but certainly the one that's the most coherent, on the genealogy of morals by Nietzsche. And in this book, and I'm going to talk about it just briefly, Nietzsche talks about not what's right and wrong in the way we did in previous lectures, good or bad actions, but the word genealogy talks about what were the origins of the situations within which we make the value judgments. In other words, from where did this distinction come? Good, bad, right, wrong, and so on. Now, Nietzsche's argument is rather abrasive. It's certainly provocative, and the genealogy of morals traces the moral form of discourse, good, bad, right, wrong, back to originally, and again, this is these 19th century Germans again, back to the Greeks. Now, here Nietzsche talks about the Greeks as having, and the word he uses is very important, and this will move us finally back to our account of the present. Nietzsche talks about the translation of virtue. What was virtue for the Greeks? Nietzsche was a philologist who could never get a normal job as a professor because he was a little nuts, okay? And anyway, that wouldn't have stopped him now, but it stopped him then. For the Greeks, virtue, when I said the word, I could see all of you go, oh, virtue. Yeah, it wasn't like that for the Greeks. I've already given you the Greek ideal of Odysseus, where virtue included the ability to be a clever liar. In other words, knowing when and who to con was important. That's not part of the Victorian idea of virtue, but it's part of the Greek ideal of it. And so virtue for them meant this excellence in being well-rounded. It meant to be excellent at revenge, so that unlike the Christian ideal of virtue, if someone strikes you, you strike them back, and the reason you do that is because if you don't, it will offend them worse. It will hurt their honor and yours. Much more virtuous to hit them back, and then both your honors are intact. It will only humiliate them to turn your face as though they were unworthy scum. Now hit them back. So Nietzsche discusses this use of virtue, and the Greek evaluation he calls noble. Now, noble for Nietzsche is not itself a term of value, but a kind of descriptive term of the way the Greeks evaluated. And he himself is not doing ethics the way I was doing it the other day. This is not, he's giving, as it were, a genealogy, a history of the way in which we've come to use these words. For Nietzsche, the key movement in the way the words good, bad, right, and wrong occur around the word virtue, and occur with the Christian transformation of virtue from something active based on excellence into something filled with what Nietzsche calls resentment. And I guess there's a simple way to make the argument, and I'm trying to keep my remarks here at a level where they are debatable. What he means is something like this. For the Greeks, you know, someone who was strong enough to sin went ahead and sinned, which meant they did what they wanted to and enjoyed it, and for the Greeks, that was good. The Christian idea of virtue, which includes the idea of guilt and sin, meant that you want to do something real bad and you don't, and they're frustrated and filled with resentment towards those sinners who go ahead and do what they want to do. And you turn the name of your fault, cowardice, into a virtue. Really, you just didn't have the guts to go ahead and do what you wanted to do, trying to make it sound even slimier than it is. But this is Nietzsche's argument. You didn't have the strengths to go ahead and pursue what you really wanted. And so your name for that inability is your virtue. You didn't do it. Well, we know that doesn't work out frequently because we have several notorious cases. The Jimmy Swaggart case shows that the most virtuous sometimes fall. But it's worse than that. As Nietzsche says, this Christian notion of virtue is a double trap. Because let's suppose someone who has the strength to pursue excellence goes ahead and does what they want to do and finds satisfaction. Then, because the whole field within which right and wrong is understood in the Christian era is different than the whole field within which right and wrong is understood in the earlier period, when you go ahead and do that, then you pay another price, guilt. That's where you internally torment yourself for the very paradoxical and perverse reason that you did what you wanted to do. You go, damn, I'm so bad, I did what I wanted to do. You don't do what you want to do, and you feel, as it were, helpless, but a little bit smug, and then resentful towards others that do otherwise. That's resentment. Or you go ahead and do it, and then feel guilty and have resentment towards yourself. So Nietzsche talks about this reversal of values as a reversal of values from the Greek values. And the key word is virtue. Virtue is very differently understood in the Victorian era. And this is what Nietzsche talks about in the genealogy of morals, is one of the things the argument does, whether you like it or not, or whether you accept it or not, and I've only outlined it in a kind of a snide, quick way here today, whether you like it or not, the interesting part of Nietzsche's project is that what we could see, and I haven't done that in here, but what we could have presented as eternal problems of morality, in Nietzsche's account we become very aware that these so-called eternal problems change radically depending on where you happen to be in history. What gets called good is different if you happen to be in one society or one historical period and in another. Now that seems like the shocking claim that it's all relative, right? That's where Nietzsche's supposed to be so abominably bad for a real humanistic education, that it's all relative. Well, this is not a part of the argument. What Nietzsche is trying to show is that knowledge, truth, objectivity, and good and bad have conditions for possibility. And those conditions for possibility change. That doesn't destroy what seems to be someone who lives in the Victorian period's right to call someone a sinner. In fact, it's a condition for the possibility of them doing it. You see what I mean? It's not that everything is relative. It's that there are conditions within which evaluations take place that themselves require analysis. In other words, his account is not a moral theory, but it is a theory about how we have come to have the moral theories we do have. How we've come to have the ones that we do have. Freud paid a tremendous compliment to Nietzsche. Freud said that Nietzsche knew more about himself than any other human had ever known or was ever likely to know. He's a fairly smart guy, I guess. Nietzsche was very bright. His main target was Christianity, and I'm going to now, we're going to return to a more contemporary critique of Christianity. And in this lecture, I'm going to present a little bit of Nietzsche's critique of Christianity. And the reason I'm going to do it and how it's connected with my earlier remarks is to this very day, in spite of the so-called secularization of the world, values, especially in the United States, in our culture, and again we're working for a theory of the present, are still by and large Christian values. Those are the official public ones, right? The official public values. Again, the gap between how they're practiced and what they are, it's all a matter of dispute. But growing out of the discourse of Hegel, there are other critiques, as I say, Nietzsche's is one. He focuses on the values that surround Christianity. So I'm going to talk about him a little bit more now, and then in the next lecture I want to talk about a Christian who has a criticism of modern Christianity. So you'll get both sides. You'll get one guy who's sort of, you'll know before I'm through here, thinks Christianity was a mistake. From the standpoint of the species, it was a mistake. He goes, well, not quite, a 2,000-year mistake. I mean, it was more than that. It was a little bit more catastrophic. Nietzsche thinks that among the other ill effects of Christianity, one of them is very banal. It's the habit of bad reading. He explains how many of us are raised in churches where when we bother to read, now this won't hold for many of our Jewish friends or people who believe other religions, but in the Christian tradition, we're taught to read the Old Testament, where every stick of wood, every stone, every snake, every bird, every bat is a sign of Jesus. And Nietzsche points out that this inculcates in us habits of bad reading. It does. And, if you think about it, he says, well, now, in that book there, and then the preacher reads some just unintelligible piece of the Old Testament, the locusts have no king, they fly, and that means Jesus is coming. And you go, yeah, okay. Nietzsche says this makes you not read well. Being brought up this way tends to make you not read well. It's worse than that, however, and that's that the way Christianity presents itself is as a doctrine of love and compassion. Certainly that has something to do with its appeal to our national character. And that's good, to a doctrine of love and compassion. Nietzsche's concern in this book, The Genealogy of Morals, is to show that what's beneath that mask of love and compassion is really a doctrine of resentment and hatred. And I think I can make that come alive for you with some pretty banal examples. One would be Jerry Falwell, who discusses homosexuals. He loves them. How many people believe he really loves them? See, I don't. I think he hates them. His way of hating them is to love them. That's the trick Nietzsche was after. The trick about how resentment, envy, and hatred can be masked with these words, love and compassion. It's an important argument today because I think we've become a suspicious culture. Nietzsche's been called one of the masters of suspicion. Paul Ricoeur, the philosopher, called him a master of suspicion. Ricoeur is a Christian as well. He just thinks that reading these books is the mediation through which any modern kind of faith would have to pass. You'd have to read them, understand them before you'd know what you meant by having faith. In any case, Nietzsche sees this dynamic of resentment and envy as being, as it were, the unspoken or the code, beneath the code of Christianity. And so for the first time in the course, I'm going to pull out a section of a book that I want to look at, if I can find the correct quote here. This is from the Genealogy of Morals. In this edition, it's on page 48. It's section 15 of the first essay. Nietzsche's discussing Christian love, as it were, and faith and hope. Nietzsche, in his rather cynical way, says, in faith in what? In love of what? In hope of what? These weak people, someday or other, they too intend to be strong. Have you ever heard an evangelist and got that feeling that while they were real meek, someday they intended to be real strong? Yeah, that's the idea. There's no doubt of that, because they say their kingdom is coming. They term it the kingdom of God because, after all, one should be so humble in all things. To experience that kind of duplicity, one needs to live a long time. Dante, I think, committed a crude blunder when, with a terror-inspiring ingenuity, he placed the gateway of his hell the inscription, I too was created by eternal love. At any rate, there would be more justification for placing above the gateway to the Christian paradise and its eternal bliss the inscription, I too was created by eternal hate, provided a truth could be written above the gateway to a lie. What constitutes the bliss of this paradise. Well, Nietzsche goes on to quote not Cherry Falwell, but St. Thomas Aquinas, great teacher, saint, certainly knew more about Christianity than I do or most of us. Thomas Aquinas says that the blessed in the kingdom of heaven will see the punishments of the damned in order that their bliss be more delightful for them. At that moment in Nietzsche's text, something sort of creepy should come up your back. You should go, St. Thomas Aquinas said that in heaven, our chief bliss would be that we could see all those mean people that got us while we were alive, having all that stuff ripped off of them eternally, forever. And Nietzsche's text wants to bring alive for us the barbarism, the hatred that must be buried in such a doctrine of love as its core. It's a very frightening argument, but it isn't limited, and I don't want to limit it, to a set of Christian values specifically, but to certain duplicitous ways in which words of value are used in general. The way that a bomb can be dropped lovingly, surgically. See, when you cut someone in surgery, you do it to heal them, right? That's what a surgical strike is. That's what a surgeon does. Cuts the cancer out, leaves the patient alive. But that's not all a surgical strike is, you see. This field within which good and bad appear so clearly to us, or supposed to, I think some of us may be getting a little confused, but in which values are supposed to be so clearly appear to us, may very well have these duplicities built within them. A surgical strike may not be like surgery with Dr. Kildare. It could turn out there could be some resentment and hatred beneath it. There might be. It's possible. Nietzsche is not trying to argue demonstratively or to prove a syllogism, but rather to raise suspicions, to raise the kinds of suspicions that, as I say, I think many of us have when we look at the content of the values that have come up to us, you know, through our traditions. That's what Nietzsche is powerfully and importantly good for. Not to deny, again, not to say all is relative, but to try to remind us of something of the origins of what we call good and bad, right and wrong, and so on. By the way, these values have come out in other contexts. I remember in an earlier war, General Westmoreland saying, we had to destroy the village in order to save it. But it was not an irony. He meant it. I mean, so did the early Christian communities that settled in this country mean it. That for a witch's own good, one had to dunk her repeatedly in water. Now, we've come a long way since then, haven't we? Because now we lock people away in prisons and in institutions, torment them with drugs, lock them up in the most dangerous environments, have more people in prison in this country per capita than any country in the world except South Africa. I don't know. They may be, the new South Africa may be ahead of us. Who knows? But we haven't gotten as far ahead in this regard as we think, and this argument has been updated by people like Michel Foucault. We still have the idea that we would send someone to prison in order to rehabilitate them. Now we're getting to be more honest about that. We're getting a little more barbaric, and for Nietzsche that would be better. That'd be a little more honest. We're sending them to prison because we're scared of them and that we know if they go there, really bad things will happen to them and it will ruin their lives and that will make us happy. That's what we should say when we send one to prison. If, you know, to be honest, and as Nietzsche said, in the name of minimal honesty, don't send them to prison and go, that was the best thing for them. You know, because you, man, but prejudice culture stuff before. Probably when I was too young. But, I mean, why will heaven be a lot of fun? All the people we didn't like, and that will be a lot of fun. It'll be a real gig. By nice, I mean not moral. We're in this moral universe where duplicity is built into being virtuous. Still, you see how I said earlier for the Greeks telling lies well was sort of openly acknowledged as something clever to do, but that duplicity is still built into the concept of virtue in a way. I mean, we can't really tell the truth even about wars, as you know. We can't really let it all hang out and say, well, you know, we started off just to invade Kuwait and get it back, but now we're really pissed. And we want to kill all those damn Arabs, every one of them, man, that damn Saddam, and any of those other people that are yelling and burning our flag too. Well, I've been out and around the country, and that's the attitude out there. It's not, it's funny, it's sort of the lower you go down the educational scale, the more honest it gets. It's kind of, that's sort of nice. At the university, we have a lot of professors who believe the same thing, who just won't say it that way. They believe it, they just won't say it. Instead, they'll do a sort of General Haig kind of discussion of it, the way Al Haig talks, sort of in State Department-ese, full of lots of ing words and coinages that are not found in the English language, that, you know, just cover over the real situation, when what Al Haig really wants to say is, I'm in charge, and the dark little people will die. That's the message. And it's right and good that they should die, because they will die so that everyone can be free in a new world order. And right on, let's go get them, kick butt, drop bombs, they die, don't talk, kill. It's like a proposal for surrender as follows. You surrender or we bomb you while you sit there, but of course if you get up to leave, we will bomb you while you're walking away. Is that a good policy? See, that's almost Nietzschean, isn't it? Surrender, but don't move. Of course, if you don't move, you won't have surrendered. So we'll have to bomb you. But if you move, we won't be sure you've surrendered, so we'll have to bomb you. So surrender, but we'll bomb you. It's kind of a policy designed to do what? Bomb people. They can go, don't, but it won't help, because they'll either have to be still or moving, or some condition in between. Again, it'd be better openly to say, now that we've got this thing going, we're all good Christians, we want to do the right thing, and we're all believers in good democracy, but for the moment, let's forget it. This is too much fun. Let's really hammer them. And let's prove that our version of the Peloponnesian War, the one that made the Greeks so confused about their values, in our culture, we had a war like that confused us about our values. Vietnam, and it's kind of a background theme of the current war, of a philosophy of the present, to which I'm now connecting the discourse of Nietzsche loosely. A target might be to kill the guilt and the fear that we're... Which it has always seemed to me to be totally uninteresting to ask, was that really what he was like? For God's sakes, we don't even normally want to know that, really. I mean, if you've seen a great Billy the Kid movie, and there have been so many that a few of them have had to be good, right? And you see a really good Billy the Kid movie, it's not fun to go, was Billy really like that? I mean, who cares, you know? I mean, because that one was interesting and fascinating. So Plato's Socrates is such a fascinating character. I'm not sure what Socrates was really like. There are reasons, I think, and Nietzsche makes some of them clear, why in principle I couldn't be sure about that. Part of our fascination with time machines might be with interpretation, actually. Maybe our fascination with time machines, you know, like Back to the Future, Back to the Past, and now Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventures Through Time. Well, I like some of those, but I'm digressing a bit, but forgive me here. Bill and Ted's latest bogus adventure is a parody of Ingmar Bergman's The Seventh Seal, where they go to hell and play Twister and Battleship with the devil instead of chess. That will be a symptom of a postmodern culture. See, modernist humans will be worried about death. It will reverberate in sort of their being. And because there won't be a field of meaning to answer it, the problems of life and death, we will get the problem called nihilism. But when you cross a certain threshold point, a threshold point where people's real issue is, am I alive now? And that question seems radically undecidable, then you get cultural artifacts like Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure, where the best response seems to be a kind of giddy, silly ecstasy at the very inability to have a self. I mean, and I can't say that I don't share some of the fun of it for our younger generation of quasi-cyborgs that will be raised in this postmodern culture. They will be unrecognizable, perhaps, within a few generations. Everybody's saying, oh, well, that's impossible. Well, let me try to generate this kind of historical change that Nietzsche was one of the first to foresee and to discuss, and which I will discuss throughout this course under the heading of nihilism, and that will be the social and experiential side of the problems of interpretation, although they're also experiential to me. And that's the problem of nihilism is the problem of finding meaning in a world that is no longer God-centered. That did not mean for Nietzsche any more than it did for Marx or Weber or the other people who gave accounts of modern life, that there would no longer be a lot of religious people. You follow me? And it didn't mean that there still wouldn't be churches and believers, and there still wouldn't be holy wars and so on. It meant that an overarching cosmological story into which you could fit, that provided a background of meaning and a place for you, would be radically missing, and in its place there would be market relations, in which what you were would amount to what you do for a living. So a lot of you know about me, I do have a couple of my ex-students in here, but a lot of you know about me is that I do university stuff for a living. See, and that isn't a remark about my predilection, which is something I've talked about before. This is over my predilections. It's a mark about my profession, but it's more than that. Under these social conditions, it is an absolutely ontological remark about what I am. You know, when people at a dinner party say, "What do you do?" that is not a trivial remark. It's a story about a culture. What do you do? Answers what you are. Now, I know people resist this, and I enjoy the resistance. You know, at dinner parties, you go, "Well, I'm a writer." It's sort of almost a joke if you're at a dinner party in New York. "I'm an artist. I'm a performance artist. I'm a writer. I'm a this." And you find, "Well, but I mean, you know, what do you do?" They go, "I drive a cab. I wait tables." But my third novel is, I'm working on it. Yeah. No, this is a culture full of market relations where the construction of meaning becomes the burden of a newly constructed category, the individual, the bourgeois individual, the individual of modern life, the individual competitor on a market, in a market. No longer the member of, like, the community of God in the broad sense, you know, of the feudal period, but someone who must construct the meaning of their lives in singularity. Let me say that instead of alone. With their, you know, sort of in singular, with their own resources. And that is a task that Max Weber thought would overburden them. And it's a task that Nietzsche thought almost impossible still to make meaning out of his own life in a context, and this, again, this word nihilism, I'll say a little bit more about it, in a context where the threat was nihilism, a culture where there was no fabric from which to construct meaning. Now, nihilism, in a certain way, then, won't be used by me to describe a philosophical position, because to the extent it does, it's supposed to be some silly position like this. Nihilists are people who believe in nothing. Well, if that's what nihilists were, there wouldn't be any, and that's not what we're diagnosing. We're diagnosing a nihilistic culture where no enduring beliefs can provide meaning for the overwhelming majority of members of that culture. That's the problem that Nietzsche identifies coming along with modern life, and also not coming along as a mystification, but coming along as part of the inside of modern life. Comes along with Darwin. In other words, being demystified about our origins. It comes along with a new view of the cosmos, being demystified about the importance of the earth. You know, where it is and how big it is and in the center of what. Being demystified concerning a whole series of things about which earlier there were powerful, important, meaning-giving myths. Part of the work of the Enlightenment was this destructive work of destroying myths. That was the work carried out by the bourgeois class and by its ideologues. I mean, it's not bad. I mean, you remember they said we won't have a decent world to live in until the last priest is hung on the guts of the last king and stuff. I mean, those are the mottos of the great revolutions. This is Washington, D.C., right? These are the great bourgeois revolutions. We love them, and they may be, in fact, a world historic destiny. Nietzsche's worry was that this kind of demystification, without creating new festivals, new games, new myths, would lead to a situation in which human beings willed only not to will any longer, who wanted sort of only not to want any longer. And Nietzsche saw this emerging culture as one that would be inimical to human life, about which, as I said, he doesn't have a lot of consoling things to say. So I'm going to read a little passage of Nietzsche and try to stop there to give us a frame within which Nietzsche views human beings. Now, I don't think this is all that theoretic, and I don't want it to be. I want it to be something that you can grab a hold of and understand, because this is kind of a modern myth I'm about to spell out for you. In fact, I may not read it, I may just gloss it. It's a modern myth that I'd like to spell out for you that many of us believe. And let's see, after we've examined this myth, if this is more or less comforting than the beautiful myth of redemption in, say, for example, the Bible. The myth is something like this. There are billions and billions of stars. The earth is a tiny one. We crawl across it for just a few seconds, and then we individually are gone. Billions and billions of eons of time before and billions afterwards pass. And the earth eventually goes out like a cinder, and perhaps the whole universe collapses into itself. And after all that's happened, absolutely nothing will have been done. Now, that's a very important myth. Many of us believe that one too. But against that background, it becomes difficult as we chip away at our daily little lives, selling shoes, selling tires, teaching class, to try to find any damn thing that means anything. So our search through Nietzsche will not be a search for dogmatic answers to that question, but to follow his quest and ours for a form of self-creation under circumstances and with a background of myths that do not make it seem likely that we will have a happy result. So the end of my first lecture is that our interpretive efforts here, too, are bound to fail. Actually, madness becomes, at this point, I think, and in a culture like ours, maybe we should return to a sort of a feudal view of madness. In the feudal period, the mad were looked upon as having brilliant insights of wisdom, because they would say things that were outside the bounds of normal talk. And their sayings, as you may know, and this was true even in Greece, their sayings were frequently considered to be profound and absolutely worth your attention. And it wasn't until Freud that we again began to pay attention to these mad ramblings and interpret them as though they might contain something worth understanding. Something worth understanding. So there are far worse things than being mad. And one of them is to be in a culture that is mad and to consider yourself sane. That's worse. To be involved in a consensual hallucination of normalcy is much worse than being mad. So maybe I would like to valorize madness in this way. I mean, in the plays of Shakespeare, which I will now briefly discuss because I didn't mean to imply ever that I didn't enjoy them, has anyone ever noticed how frequently Shakespeare makes use of the fool to deliver the wisdom? Dialectically and brilliantly, Shakespeare will have the fool sort of skip onto the stage and deliver the wisdom. Even in Hamlet, the gravedigger who plays the fool in Hamlet is dead. See, Hamlet's a dark play. Yorick is the king's jester. He's dead already, but the gravedigger does not stand in for him in the scene. he delivers some of the real wisdom of the play. Throughout Shakespeare, we have these fools, madmen, jugglers, jesters, clowns, delivering the real wisdom of the play. And it's perverse to see a culture that then takes some of this Shakespearean wisdom, you know, whatever, from the canon and sort of perverts it. I mean, I remember studying Shakespeare, and they gave me this quote to remember from Polonius, you know, "To thine own self be true." This could be the first line of every 12-step plan or therapy. "To thine own self be true, and it follows as the night the day, that thou cannot then be false to any man." Of course, in the context of the play, you realize that Polonius is a bureaucrat, a politician, a windbag, a blowhard, shallow, stupid, and his wisdom is, as I said earlier, just exactly the banality of a common mind. But yet, you know, grade school, we teach this. See how smart Shakespeare was? Yeah, he was smart enough to show that that wasn't wisdom. That kind of commonplace crap wasn't wisdom. He was that smart and more. Well, anyway, Nietzsche, in search of other self-descriptions and in search of new myths to replace the dying old ones, myths that we could, as it were, participate in and perhaps enjoy and enhance life, rather than, you know, in the case of many of these therapeutic approaches, put an end to the struggle of subjectivity by putting an end to our own subjectivity. Blessed, in fact, are the sleepy, for they shall soon drop off. It's a nice, one of my favorite Nietzsche quotes. Blessed are the sleepy, for they shall soon drop off. Well, to return to the postmodern terrain, Buddhism, as we now know, along with many other religions, are antiquated in the face of a telecommunicational network which has more than replaced all the functions of traditional religion. More than replaced it, subjectively and objectively. And, I mean, Plato's cave, we don't need to see the shadows on the wall because the shadows are in our television, and we have televisions. It is a stupid strategy to think that you can turn them off. All that can happen is they can turn you off. You can't turn them off. Try to explain that remark because many people around universities love to brag, I don't watch TV. Well, damn, that's historically crazy and unconscious. Don't you realize that's something like saying after the invention of the Gutenberg printing press and then later the availability of cheap printed material to go snottily around saying, well, I only read things handwritten in Latin. I don't read these new books off these printing presses. These paperbacks, to hell with them. They're the devil's things. I don't read those paperbacks. Well, that's how I feel about intellectuals. I don't watch movies. I don't watch TV. As if you could escape an entire world whose culture is being shaped by this and the subjectivities of millions of what will be culture and objective spirit shaped by these new instruments and new forces. As if one could escape it by turning a switch. That's why I say you can't turn off TV. It can turn you off, but you can't turn it off. You can't make it disappear, but it can make you disappear. I mean, it's just not that relation. Nietzsche, of course, when he talked about nihilism in The Last Man, had no idea that nihilism would be technologically achievable and that it would not upset people as much as he thought. That the death of human subjectivity, that the end of projects that are our own, and the turn towards projects invented, packaged for us, sometimes by machines and not even by human advertisers or whatever, but just simply packaged by machine, along demographic programs written up by other machines, that would become the new array of things that are supposed to give us meaning is, as it were, beyond nihilism. You know, this is not a culture that believes in nothing. This is a culture that is rooted in the will to nothingness, in Nietzsche's sense, and at the same time is, in a certain sense, giddy about it. I mean, there's a certain giddiness to it that I don't want to deny. You know, a sort of giddy feeling that well, you know, if you took undergraduate philosophy and you read Descartes, you thought, oh, maybe an evil demon is fooling me all the time. And you just thought about it
in Introduction to Philosophy class as a thought experiment that you might be wrong, and then you were going to regain your reason. But now the greater skepticism has arisen that this whole telecommunicational world is one giant consensual hallucination within which you as a singularity, Bill, Bob, Susan, and so on, simply cannot find your way about at all. It's not an evil demon anymore that you just thought up. You look at the fabric of social reality and become skeptical about your everyday life and whether it has any meaning at all. And this is not some empty skepticism, merely philosophical skepticism. It is quite general. Believe me, talk to your friends. Talk to people at gas stations, for God's sakes. Well, geez, I don't know what's going on anymore. It's so weird. The most standard phenomenological or descriptive remark about the current social terrain, to which I do believe Nietzsche pointed the way in his remarks, is haven't things gotten weird? Which isn't an analysis, but certainly points the way towards one, Things have gotten strange. I can explain why people take crack now instead of LSD. I can explain that using this view that things have gotten weird and that we have a postmodern trajectory. LSD is superfluous in the 90s. Reality itself is so twisted that it's a waste of time. Why would anyone take acid in this culture to try to twist your mind? Hell, just watch TV for a few months. You don't need that. You don't need acid anymore. It's just silly. It's just silly. It's a redundant drug. It's unnecessary in a culture like this one. It's a redundant drug. Now, crack, on the other hand, has a certain rationality to it from both the perspectives of the rulers and the ruled. For one thing, from the perspective of the rulers, the opium of the people, it turns out, is much better when it's real opium. So the opium of the people now is opium, and that's very copacetic for people who want to do crowd control. It's nice that the potentially rebellious crowds are stoned out of their minds, and crack does that. It doesn't give you this happy, I don't want to work, marijuana stuff. It's just out, okay? And that's good for the rulers. On the side of the ruled, the desperate, crack, unlike LSD, doesn't enhance or freakify anything. It just sort of nails your head out of things for a while. Sort of jacks you out of this consensual hallucination. It's vicious and it's an ugly drug. This is no argument. I'm trying to explain how drugs, this is an important Nietzschean point, because Nietzsche thinks that intoxication, and this, I try to make it fit, I think it does fit. Intoxication has always been an important part of cultures, certainly American culture. And now I'll just leave it as a thesis for you. If anything was left that was real, it might have been war. And it may be the case now that even war is not real. And that's a horrifying remark coming from someone who was raised by someone like my father, for whom the Second World War was a, if not the pivotal event in his life. And perhaps some of our postmodern dissatisfaction anticipated by bizarre theorists like Nietzsche and Kierkegaard, perhaps to the extent there is dissatisfaction with it, perhaps some of that dissatisfaction is rooted in the desire to feel an experience again, to live a real experience again. Something that really occurred, that wasn't already packaged, explained, prepackaged, agreed upon, then given to you as your opinion without a possibility of doing anything but assenting. And you may go, oh no, they give us choice. Well, we all know what the array is and how infinite it is. It's like choosing green beans at the grocery store. How many kinds do they have? Say you want canned green beans. I'm a throwback. I like canned green beans. I don't like the ones that you put in the little plastic pouch. I want the canned ones. And I get a choice. There are like 20 kinds. I've tried a lot of them. I open them and they're all just really bad green beans. They're green, and they're beans, and they're this long, and they've got the same amount of water. And I've chosen, and that's true, I've chosen, and I want that freedom to choose, and I would fight and die for that freedom to choose the green bean of my choice. But what I don't have is the choice to select that autonomous radical project that Nietzsche put at the center of his writing and at the center of his attempt at self-creation. That's what the choice I don't have. I feel sometimes as though I'm plugged into a giant computer that will take every command I give it except the one that I want the most. The command that the damn machine blow itself up. It will do anything else. I'll say, I'll type in food. Now it comes food. I'll type in, I want to give this talk in Washington. Type this in, it comes out. But the one command I want is the command for the damn thing to just go boom. And all the little transistors just do glow. I think some of that archaic anarchism may lurk out there somewhere, I hope, that as I enter, now in this really strong paradox, because without a postmodern culture there would be no televised lectures on Nietzsche. I hope as I enter that spiral of information that I can, plant here and there tiny little moments of that kind of rebellion which are planted throughout the text of Zarathustra in the forms of jokes, arguments that are both suspicious and suspecting, and moments of transgression and fun. And I hope that I'll be able to do that in the last hour when I will wander even farther away from Nietzsche. But that is in the spirit of Nietzsche because he always valorized wanderers, nomads, vagabonds, jokesters, and tricksters. And I intend to valorize them as well. So I hope you're ready for the concluding lecture on Nietzsche's progeny. That lecture, of course, has got to be some kind of joke. He had no children, so what would his progeny be? Well, I hope this indication of what I mean by the postmodern condition will give you an idea about the icy glacial terrain in which these progeny are slouching toward Bethlehem, waiting to be born. Well, maybe anything that's interesting may be untimely, I don't know. In any case, if we look at the 19th century that way, as that being at least one of the big stories, then certainly one of the big stories of the mid to late 20th century would be the incredible increase in the switch from technologies which concentrate on increasing the intensity and the power of manual labor to those which tend to replace mental, intellectual labor. By that I mean not just computers, but the whole array of devices intended to replace, for lack of a better word, human experience. Subjective human experience. Television is an instrument of production, in my opinion, designed, whether it was with this in mind or not, functioning, in any case, to replace, largely, subjective human experience. Computers, designed sometimes for the direct technical function of replacing intellectual experience. In other words, things like adding, multiplying, dividing, subtracting. Really difficult now to get a child in the second or third grade to bother to learn to do that, and for obvious reasons. They have 3 keys they know how to punch. Why should they do that with their minds? Why waste that labor? Well, I'm not saying that in a cynical way, because it's like asking after you've built a steam engine why you should take a toothpick and knock over a mountain instead of using a steam drill. I'm not saying our children are wrong. Maybe they should say, well, geez, you invented all this stuff to replace intellectual labor, now you're asking me to do that? Give me a break. It'd be like asking you in the early 19th century to knock over a mountain and forget those new steam drills. This replacement, however, of, as it were, the other part of the human equation, if we think of the human equation as being something about humans as embodied, and then humans as intelligent and subjective and rational, then we will see that, as it were, the advance of society has tended to replace both the human attributes that belong to mechanical skills, manual skills, as well as to intellectual skills. One of the reasons we value sport so much now is that the replacement of the laboring body required for the development of our society can be vicariously enjoyed when we see Michael Jordan dunk. And we remember, quasi-nostalgically, the beauty and the pleasures of the body. Although, of course, now deferred into an image. Because the secret of a postmodern society is that everything that was directly lived has moved away into a representation or an image. Everything that was directly lived has moved away into a representation or an image. So that we, as it were, enjoy the vicarious pleasure of a flying body. We hear the jingle, "Be like Michael, be like Michael." We participate vicariously in the beauty of the body, but this time as an image. As an image. This is a different, I'm arguing, a different trajectory for culture. That people that come after this time will be different subjectivities, if we still want to use that word. It will be debatable. It will be debatable. Nietzsche still lived and wrote in a time when the problem of theology was the believer or the non-believer. How to respond to the non-believer. The problems in theology and philosophy today, when they're posed at their highest levels, are not the problems of believers and non-believers, but of humans and the non-human. You see, until you have a certain subjective framework, the issue of belief doesn't even arise. The issue arises about, are the people to whom we address ourselves still human? And then it will be interesting again to discuss gods, their powers, magic, mystery, murder in the rain, and so on, once we've determined the deeper question about whether a society that first replaces sort of physical labor and then later begins to replace mental labor as it progresses does not efface the human entirely. I've argued that it already has begun to move it away into a representation or into an image. Well, this possibility is the possibility of what I would like to call, in the spirit of Nietzsche, nihilism technologically realized. That's scarier than Nietzsche's nihilism as a form of belief which would bring an end to this atmosphere within which the world was still mendacious and magical. This would be the technological realization of nihilism. Let me try to make that clear to you by explaining something that I think we all will know as a familiar example. There are great apocalypse stories in the in the Bible has a pretty good apocalypse story, right? I think it's Boom, Revelation. Certain preachers really like to do that one, and it's exciting, and there are riders and thunder. The fact that apocalypse was technologically achievable and that we could set up all the technical necessities for it is now very old news, isn't it? Am I wrong about that? Or isn't the fact that we have technologically achieved the ability to construct a real apocalypse? I'm not now talking about a biblical myth, but an apocalypse on a high order. I mean, now that the Soviet Union's breaking up and that particular myth is fading into other myths and other stories and other narratives, this possibility may not seem as real, but it's important to see that people born into a culture in which apocalypse is now a technological possibility that will be carried out by faceless people in little silos and guys carrying little briefcases, punching little buttons, is an incredible distance from these intricately constructed myths in the Old Testament, and I mean in the New Testament. And it's a different kind of apocalypse because this one is a technological achievement. Similarly, I'm arguing that Nietzsche's nihilism was still a matter of the drying up of a certain kind of subjectivity and belief formation, and Nietzsche's hope was the creation of new ones, subjectivities. new, radical, autonomous subjectivities. And again, because he doesn't belong to the dogmatic tradition in philosophy, not necessarily, or not at all, perhaps, subjectivities like his own. But a possibility that I think Nietzsche himself did not face was that nihilism, the belief in nothing, the will to nothingness, the end of subjectivity, of human powers, would itself become technologically realizable. So I hope that my example of the development of weapons of so-called mass destruction, which from our postmodern perspective, I've argued already, seems giddy and utopian. I mean, now we look back on that and we go see those old atomic war movies, and I watch the audiences, and they just love the blow-up scenes. No kidding. They go, wow, boom, look at that, the trees are flat, and already to us, that's a nostalgic moment. It was perhaps our last chance to realize a decent end to our species, one that would have been worthy of it. Now we may just trod endlessly, solving one little technical adjustment after another to the finely tuned echo machines that we used to call our bodies. I mean, the possibilities for radical subjectivities arising under these conditions become exceedingly bizarre. Now, you go, oh, well, this is too much. Okay, this is too postmodern. I'm lost now. I can't. Well, believe me, that again, the development in the late 20th century and the trajectory of it shouldn't be underestimated. It really shouldn't. And I don't want it to be necessarily, in fact, it cannot, because of other necessary conditions, be a moment of despair, since that's long over with. The example I gave of that was, we all know that existentialism, what we used to think Nietzsche was, right, an existentialist. Kierkegaard was an existentialist. Very shallow way to understand them, and that's been over a long time. Now, if you want an existentialist, as I said earlier, you'll see Bill and Ted's Bogus Adventure, playing Twister with death. And that moment's over a long time ago. I even had a professor who said the only reason it ever was so big is that a lot of professors found it to be a very convenient way to meet people and so on. Say, I've been worried about dying, so have I, and then you strike up a conversation. Like one of Woody Allen's movies, the joke was, can we go out Saturday night? And no, I'm committing suicide on Friday. Woody Allen says, well, what about Thursday then? Oh. Well, clearly the technologies that are coming, and I'll mention a few of them, virtual reality suits. You go, well, oh, wow, now he's flipped, virtual reality suits. No, they were actually developed for a quite sensible reason. They were developed for long space flights back in the days when NASA thought they were going to go on long space flights. Now we understand that there's no need to, because we can go to Epcot Center and experience one, so we don't need it for the consuming public. That's because we can already experience a long space flight at Epcot Center, just like we don't need to go to Switzerland anymore. We can go to Busch Gardens, where the Swiss food is even more Swiss. We can buy a Swiss clock, and we can avoid all the problems connected with travel. And experience Switzerland, The thing is, I'm not even joking, because when you go to Switzerland, there'll be the same stuff, and McDonald's will be there too, and the television will be on the same channels, and the Holiday Inn will be open, and the room will look just like the one does here, and so on. This postmodern space is not a dream of theorists. It is becoming our culture and way of life. I'm just describing it. I don't even know how to denounce it. This is not a criticism. Some parts of it make me feel giddy and kind of excited, because virtual reality suits, if we let our imaginations go for a moment, could have endless, fascinating possibilities. Right? Right, sure. I mean, you can, lots of things that human powers couldn't accomplish, right? In the 19th century, lots of things that can be accomplished by human power were accomplished by steam power and so on. Well, maybe our imaginations are limited in that the machines we build now will be able to spur them on to accomplish incredible things in that way. But anyway, the virtual reality suits, I'll talk about in just a minute, and then we'll go to something else, were created so that on a long space flight, our space traveler wouldn't become disoriented in space, but would be able to put on this suit and thus feel earthbound for a while to reorient himself or herself on their space flight. Well, now the virtual reality suit they're working on marketable versions, and that means ones that are cost effective, which means that we're still living in relations of capital, because that means somebody wants to make a dollar, which is okay. So do I. So do you. There's no reason in recognizing a necessity, no matter how cruel the necessity is. You've got to recognize them sometimes. In any case, the virtual reality suits will be marketed, and they offer this interesting technological possibility. You've always wanted to go out with Mel Gibson or, let me make sure I don't commit a gender crime so I'll get everyone in. Mel Gibson or Kathleen Turner or any combination of men, women, animals, and or whatever necessary in order to avoid committing a sexist crime, gender crime up here. Whatever combination you imagine, since under these conditions of virtual reality, whatever transgressive gender you have, you'll be able to live it out perfectly in a perfectly commodified way with a virtual reality suit anyway. Well, you want to go out with Kathleen Turner, you just plug in and press the body heat module, and then the next thing you know, you're right in the screenplay. William Hurt's out, you're in. She walks at the door, it's all great. Now, that's a product we'll want to buy. Many of us. A product we'll want to buy. The problem with this advancing culture is that that is buying, just like in an earlier period of capital, when you bought the wage labor of someone to do the work for you. Now what we're buying are instruments and equipments that do the experiencing for us. That was a part of my critique of all these instant therapies, is to buy a life story for yourself immediately that can be swallowed painlessly, you know. And when you buy a virtual reality suit, or what I call virtual reality eyes, which is television, if you look at virtual reality, it provides you a prepackaged experience, one that is already coded for you. In other words, designed with your mind in mind. Now, if you want another way to check out this new emerging terrain, this nihilism realized, what you might call Nietzsche's nightmare squared. Okay? If you want to look at this, you might look at what advertisements go with what normal channel TV programming. So, for example, if you have the Cosby Show, you'll have advertising for upscale African-American families mixed with the younger, yuppie audience that it draws. 30-something, which is now off, mercifully. Hope I can say that without getting sued, because I'm sorry, I watched it, but I got the whining. The whining got to me. Sorry, yeah, they're just whining. But in any case, the advertisements followed the story very closely. You know, you'd have a little moment when one of the characters would sort of wistfully stop whining and look around, and then the next thing you know, there'd be an ad for an infinity car. Sort of answers that need to overcome the wistful desire. Well, I'm wistful and I've whined, but if I was in my infinity, an infinity of automobiles, well, that's not just a way to get around, now is it? You see, commodities are no longer just things of use. They've become part of what we are. And we need to recognize it. I mean, that's one of the lessons that I'm trying to drive home here today, is that if there will be battles over this new terrain and on it, many of them will be fought on the terrain itself. Television, radio, magazines. As I've called it, the obscenity of the saturated communicational culture. Saturated with information. Obscenely oversaturated. Information up to your neck, beyond your elbows. That's certainly why not. Well, I mean, now I want to defend my general kind of descriptive procedure here briefly. One of the things that philosophers do as part of an anxiety complex is to try to prove they weren't wrong, so I'm going to do that very briefly. And I'm going to do it here by aligning myself with Nietzsche for at least a moment again, pulling back from the horror that I don't know if it's horror, some postmodern theorists view it as ecstasy. At a certain level of pain and strangeness, it's difficult to distinguish the two anyway. That may be a remark only about my personal pathologies. I'm not sure. But in any case, Bertrand Russell once said, and I don't remember where, but it was an irritation over philosophers who cannot be refuted according to the normal rules of truth and falsity and the empirical verification of their propositions and so on. It was a very irritating thing to him. He named, among others, Nietzsche, Kierkegaard, and so on. And he thought that they were connected in some deep sense to the growth of unreason in the 19th and 20th century, which, from my view of history, is to get things backwards. I've always thought that this strange paleo-conservative desire to blame intellectuals for things is odd. We talk about the Enlightenment, loosely in universities, as though 4 pedants could make an age of the world. You notice I haven't given an analysis of the Enlightenment, but of modernity, of modernization, of the advance of capital, because 4 pedants don't make an age. And 2 or 3 weird philosophers don't give birth to a century of unreason. Nietzsche didn't, from his drawing room, give birth to a century of cannonade, slaughter, concentration camps, CIA subterfuge, raping and the murdering of nuns, the bombing of continents, the despoiling of beaches, and the ruining of a planet. 4 or 5 pedants do not have that much power, and never have. That's just a sort of bugbear. They didn't unleash unreason on the world. Jeez, how crazy can some people get? I mean, even in the postmodern world, you shouldn't be that crazy to think 3 or 4 pedants invented this stuff. And don't think when I talk about the postmodern condition that 3 or 4 pedants invented that description. I mean, what makes these descriptions necessary is what goes on all around us and in our daily lives as we begin to feel distant from ourselves in bizarre ways. Nevertheless, Russell said, well, look, this unreasonable approach, he thought was connected to Hume's, as I've mentioned Hume before, to Hume's destruction of empiricism. What do you mean? Hume destroying the self and various other rational accounts. Russell thought the horrible consequence that followed from the multiplicity of interpretations, the many ways in which we can deploy the word truth, the shifting contexts in which we can interpret, the many narratives that we can tell. He thought the horrible consequence that followed from that was unreason. And by the way, I do like Russell in many respects, don't get me wrong, especially Russell as a person, much more interesting person than Nietzsche as a person, certainly had better politics as a person. But on this point, I disagree with Russell. Russell says, look, if there is no intellectual difference between sanity and insanity, I mean, he gets this extreme with it. Now, Russell usually doesn't talk that extremely. If there's no intellectual difference between sanity and insanity, reason and unreason, truth and falsity, well, then the lunatic who believes he is a poached egg is to be condemned solely on the ground that he is in the minority. This is a desperate point of view, and it must be hoped that in some way we can escape it. That's all Russell has to say about that point of view in his History of Western Philosophy. That's all he has to say about it. Because, acute man that he is and logician, he knows there is no reasonable and logical way to establish the authority of reason over unreason, to distinguish sanity from insanity. And so it looks like what we're left with is what a culture comes up with to decide. That frightened Russell, and I have to admit that I have a bit of Russell's nostalgia. It would be nice if we could rely on something more than, a majority feeling a certain way. Unfortunately, the negative force of my argument is that those attempts have failed and been discredited utterly as a result of our own culture and its development. We cannot, with reason, defend the distinction between reason and unreason. And that puts me in a strange position right now defending my analysis to the extent that I want to defend it. I will at least defend this much of what Russell says about it. It is a desperate point of view because it does put you in the position of saying to those who disagree with you that, well, geez, I don't think we're poached eggs. If one of you afterwards perhaps says to me, I really am a poached egg. I'm so glad you mentioned Russell mentioning poached eggs because I've always felt like a poached egg. And you expect me to have a great argument. I may just say, well, I don't feel like a poached egg, and we'll take a brief survey around here and see how many other poached eggs there are. But imagine my embarrassment, now to return to the postmodern condition. If I'm in a mall and I begin to feel like I'm in a loony bin, perhaps I'm not alone in feeling this way. I'm in a mall and I get what I call mall fever, where I just begin to look at the shoppers and the shopping frenzy and all the glass and the swirling, the twirling things, and I get mall fever and I have to get out and I begin to feel like I'm a crazy man. And yet I have no ground on which to stand being in the minority in that feeling at that moment, because that passes for sanity. And that's what could be more sane than to spend some leisure time as opposed to free time, something we don't have any more of, free time, leisure time. In the mall, I mean, that's sane. Why do I get mall fever? I must be crazy. Well, I mean, I can't defend myself any more than the person, with reasons. I mean, I can defend myself in other ways, but I can't with reasons, any more than Russell could defend the distinction between insanity and sanity, madness and reason, with other reasons. Of course, that should have been obvious, and it would have been without perhaps some of the bad lessons that I have worked against in this course on Nietzsche, drawn from the dogmatic tradition of philosophy, which I really think have been a mistake. Namely that if reason is to be anything, it better be my damn reasons you agree with. My reason. In this case, Western reason. Nothing could be harder after this little postmodern fable, if you want to consider it yet another fable, that's fine with me. Nothing could be harder than to distinguish that fable from its non-fable aspects, its real aspects. I mean, that's like asking the question in our culture about anything, whether it really occurred or not. And it can be something that's happened to you. And after you think about it a while and you've seen a few movies, and the best way you can remember it is through its similarity with the TVs and movies you've seen. And my conversation here has reflected how many movie and TV examples I've used. If that becomes the way in which you process your experience, issues like truth versus reason, reason versus madness, truth versus falsity, will simply fall away. They'll fall away because the anchor for those issues raised by Nietzsche was that very tension between what might be reasonable and what might be mad, what might be a truth that would be life-affirming for us, and what might be a lie that would not be good for us. Those distinctions will fall away. So I don't know how to put a happy twist on this story. Now, of course, I could be wrong about all this. Let me just stop and say that for a moment. This postmodern trajectory, I think, hasn't yet fully realized itself, and I could be wrong about the direction in which we're moving, and perhaps Nietzsche's nightmare won't come true. Nothing could be harder than to distinguish that fable from its non-fable aspects, its real aspects. I mean, that's like asking the question in our culture about anything, whether it really occurred or not. And it can be something that's happened to you. And after you think about it a while and you've seen a few movies, and the best way you can remember it is through its similarity with the TVs and movies you've seen. And my conversation here has reflected how many movie and TV examples I've used. If that becomes the way in which you process your experience, issues like truth versus reason, reason versus madness, truth versus falsity, will simply fall away. They'll fall away because the anchor for those issues raised by Nietzsche was that very tension between what might be reasonable and what might be mad, what might be a truth that would be life-affirming for us, and what might be a lie that would not be good for us. Those distinctions will fall away. So I don't know how to put a happy twist on this story. In fact, I feel much in the position that William Gibson does in his magnificent novel, Neuromancer. I recommend it all to you. Gibson's novel, you know how many novels begin with sentences describing the sky and the landscape? So many. You know, it's just a standard novelistic beginning. Gibson begins his novel, Neuromancer, with the following sentence, and I consider it the best first sentence in 20th century American literature. I hate to even use the word literature about this stuff. The Neuromancer being a work of what I call near future fiction, a work that projects, as does the movie Blade Runner, the near future of possible social developments based on very close analysis of current trends. In any case, the first sentence of the novel goes like this. The sky above the port was the color of television, tuned to a dead channel. Marvelous. Sets the tone for an incredible book. Short, tough, interesting, brilliant. That sentence frames for me a description of sort of the postmodern trajectory. And to distance that sentence, and there is a massive distance, you could distance it from the sentences of Zarathustra, from the gay science. You could distance it from first sentences of novels such as Call Me Ishmael, Moby Dick. That's a pretty well-known first sentence in a novel, Call Me Ishmael, referring all the way backward to a biblical text and all the way forward to a new adventure, a new American adventure in living a life that would allow for difference and community, that would allow for freedom and the recognition of necessity. And that project ends, in my view, or at least the dawning of the end, if that makes sense, in Gibson and in that wonderful first sentence. The sky above the port was the color of television, tuned to a dead channel. The fights that remain, the living antagonisms in our possibilities to construct ourselves in anything like free and autonomous ways, will have to be fought across that barren, strange landscape, that unthinkable cultural future of deferred and indifferent pseudo-experience. And across that terrain, the struggles for even moments of authentic lived experience, authentic in quotes, who knows, of lived experience, to feel something for God's sakes, anything, will be the locus of struggle and of action, we can hope. Here I will call to your mind a scene from Blade Runner where before the replicant dies, Roy Batty, he slams his hand on a nail. And many of you may not know this, but when Batty does that in the film, it's a reference to an action that Sartre has a character perform in Roads to Freedom. In Roads to Freedom, the Sartre character slams his hand onto a nail to prove that he's free, because he chose to do it. It hurt like hell, but he chose it. Oh, I put my hand on that nail, and that shows I'm free, because just a calculus of deterministic pleasure, I would never have done it. So it's a philosophical demonstration, a painful and stupid one, in my opinion. But by the time we get to Blade Runner, the replicant slams his hand onto a nail just to feel anything. Just to feel anything. So don't worry about the communist or the capitalist. Fight to feel and live anything. Thank you. I have enjoyed it very much. Thank you.